First test I have is going to be the active medial epicondylopathy test. There's no alternate name. Structures tested as pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi ulnaris. Positive findings are going to be pain along the medial epicondyle with resisted wrist flexion. So for this, they're going to be seated with their arm resting on the table with some elbow flexion and fully supinated. Stabilization, they're pretty much stabilized by the table, so for this, palpating the medial epicondyle is a little bit more important than just stabilizing. Stress point is going to be palm of the hand. Movement is going to be straight wrist flexion and then pronation, and then compensations to look out for are going to be they won't be able to fully flex their wrist or pronate. For this, elbow flexion is okay when they pronate. So sit up nice and straight. Palpate medial epicondyle. Right here, flex your wrist all the way up. Pronate. We'll do the side. Yeah, flex. Good. Next test we have is a passive tennis elbow test, also known as passive lateral epicondylopathy test. Structures include extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digiti communis, and extensor digiti minimi. So positive findings for this are going to be pain at the lateral epicondyle. Positioning for this can be seated or standing. They're going to have their elbow fully flexed, and wrist is going to be extended, and they're going to be fully supinated. So for this, stabilization is going to be mostly a palpation over the lateral epicondyle, and then stress point is going to be applied at the dorsum of the hand. So for this, we're going to move them from wrist extension, pronation, and then elbow extension. Compensations will be they'll resist and guard due to pain or have decreased range of motion. So go ahead. Start extended, flex, pronate while maintaining wrist flexion, and then extend. Any pain? So, up here, extend, anything. Next test is valgus stress test at 0 degrees. So there aren't any alternate names for this. Structures tested: pronator teres, flexi carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris, and the UCL. Positives are going to be any pain and laxity at the medial epicondyle. Positioning for this is going to be shoulder or some sort of shoulder flexion. The elbow is going to be fully supinated and fully extended. Stabilization for this is going to be distal forearm. Stress point is going to be at the lateral epicondyle, and the force is going to be a valgus force moving lateral to medial. Any compensations for this are going to be apprehension or flexing or unlocking of the elbow. So do this first. So make sure they're fully extended because the test is at 0, fully supinated. Right here, apply valgus force. Next test we have is varus stress test at 30 degrees of elbow flexion. There aren't any alternate names. Structures tested is just the radiocollateral ligament. Positive findings are going to be pain and laxity at the lateral epicondyle. Positioning can either be seated or standing. Shoulder is going to be flexed. Elbow is going to be fully supinated, but they're going to have about 30 degrees of elbow flexion. Stabilization for this is distal forearm. Stress point is going to be the medial epicondyle. Movement for this is going to be a varus force, so moving medial to laterally. Any compensations to look out for are going to be apprehension or guarding due to pain. Next test is going to be the pinch grip test. There aren't any alternate names. Specific structure is the median nerve at the anterior interosseous branch of it. Positive findings for this are going to be inability to touch the tips of the first and second fingers, like tip to tip. So positioning can either be seated or standing, but they're going to have full elbow flexion and be fully pronated. There aren't any stabilization points for this because it's an active test. And then the stress point itself is just putting the median nerve on a stretch. The movement is going to be them touching the tips of their first and second fingers together, and any compensations could be trying to like lessen their elbow flexion and pronation or touching pad to tip. So go ahead and sit up straight for me, fully flex, pronate, and then touch tip to tip. The finals test is going to be Hook's test. There aren't any alternate names for this, and it tests the biceps tendon at its distal insertion. So positive for this is going to be inability to kind of catch that tendon or feel it underneath your finger. For this, they can either be seated or standing. Their shoulder is going to be abducted, and elbow is going to be flexed to 90 degrees with their palm facing in towards them. So stabilization would be under their elbow. Unless their arms are too big, then you're going to stabilize distal forearm. There really isn't any stress point because it's just more of a passive test, so it's just making sure they're fully supported. Any movement, they're not moving at all. There's no isometric contraction or anything. So they're just kind of sitting there. And then compensations are going to be inability to even get into this starting position. So for this, you can stabilize right here. Just make sure their palm's going to face them, and you'd be able to hook under the biceps tendon.